Hello and welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, the IDF conducting a daring raid in the West Bank Tuesday morning and killing a terror suspect on its long-time most wanted list. Meantime, the fragile ceasefire between Israel and Islamic Jihad terrorists in Gaza still holding 2 days after taking effect. And later, the health of the nation at risk. Israel's health ministry scoring the public with a terrible and worrying report card. The work against terror apparently never over. First, the IDF targeting Islamic Jihad leaders over the weekend, and now the infamous commander of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades killed in a morning raid. Arriving undercover in the early morning hours, IDF forces surrounding the latest location of Ibrahim Nablusi, commander of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades in Shechem, aka Nablus, Tuesday morning. Nablusi was inside the building with several others when the IDF arrived in hopes of forcing him out for arrest. But rioters in and outside the building quickly attempting to prevent the IDF from their mission. According to the IDF, suspects threw rocks and explosives and shot at the soldiers, to which Israel responded with riot dispersal measures and live fire. The skirmish ending with Nablusi and at least 2 other assailants killed, and reports varying between 10 and 40 more wounded. As for the IDF casualties, a K9 dog with the Imam reportedly killed in the crossfire. Nablusi, meantime, wanted in connection to a number of shooting attacks against Israelis in the West Bank, along with 3 other men killed by IDF troops last February. Specifically, the 4 of them fired both at civilians and at IDF soldiers in the Nablus area, including at Joseph's tomb. And upon realizing he'd been surrounded Tuesday, Nablusi sending voice messages to his family explaining his intentions to become a martyr. In fact, his last words reportedly being, "In your honor, do not neglect the rifle," which has become a slogan amongst his men. That said, Nablusi's death landing a serious blow to Palestinian militants' morale, as Nablusi had become infamous for evading arrests, including just last month during an armed confrontation with IDF, in which at least 4 Palestinians were killed and several others injured. Additionally, Nablusi's death coming on the heels of several other arrest operations overnight, in continuing efforts to clamp down on terror suspects across Judea and Samaria. Now, it's 2 days into the ceasefire between Israel and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad terror group, and though broken in the first few minutes by Islamic Jihad, the calm is now still holding. 36 hours of quiet along the Gaza-Israel border following 3 days of heavy fighting between the IDF and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Islamic Jihad terrorists firing over 1,100 rockets towards Israeli civilian communities, while Israel precisely targeting the terror group's military leadership in Gaza, as well as in Judea and Samaria.
מבצע עלות השחר החזיר לישראל את היוזמה, החזיר את ההרתעה הישראלית, כל המטרות הושגו. כל הצמרת הצבאית של הג'יהאד האסלאמי בעזה סוכלה תוך 3 ימים, עוצמתו ותחכומו של צה"ל היכו את האויב מכה קשה. ממשלת ישראל המשיכה במדיניות עוצמתית של 0 סובלנות כלפי הטרור. מי שינסה לפגוע בנו ישלם בחייו.
Some 46 people reportedly killed in Gaza during the 3 days conflict, 16 of whom reportedly killed by failed Islamic Jihad rocket launches that landed back in the Strip, including upwards of 12 civilians. In Israel, on the other hand, some 70 people were injured, but none killed. So thankfully, the truce brokered by Egypt taking effect Sunday night and receiving high praises both locally and in the international community. Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid and others thanking Egypt for its role in maintaining regional stability, and UN officials likewise welcoming the agreement and the support for de-escalation provided by Qatar, the US, Jordan, and the PA. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, going further, though, calling on the international community to unequivocally condemn Islamic Jihad as a known terror group and proxy for Iran. Greenfield saying, quote, "It's telling that Palestinian Islamic Jihad leaders were in Tehran while the people they claim to protect were left in harm's way, and that it should also be noted that it was the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and not Israel that held up the ceasefire negotiations and prolonged hostilities in Gaza." Now, meantime, with hopes of smoothing things over with Gazans, all the crossings and the coastal waters between Israel and the Strip reopened, allowing for tens of thousands of Gazans to get back to work. Lapid saying there's another way to live that is both peaceful and mutually beneficial to everyone in the region.
אנחנו נדע להגן על עצמנו מפני כל מי שמאיים עלינו. אבל אנחנו גם יודעים לתת עבודה ופרנסה וחיים של כבוד לכל מי שרוצה לחיות בשלום לצידנו. יש עוד דרך לחיות, הדרך של הסכמי אברהם, של פסגת הנגב, של חדשנות וכלכלה, של פיתוח אזורי ופרויקטים משותפים. הבחירה בידכם. עתידכם תלוי בכם.
Now, after the war with Hamas in 2021, the international community largely condemning Israel, despite Israel defending itself against a terror group and some 4,000 rockets. How is the world reacting then to this latest conflict with Islamic Jihad? Joining to discuss is Israeli writer, social media influencer, and senior fellow at the Tel Aviv Institute, Ken Mazik. Ken, it's great to be back with you again. Now, let's start with why you think the international media may be giving less attention to this operation, to Breaking Dawn, than Protective Edge in May 2021, and particularly when comparing the first few days of each war.
I think that if you look at the enemy in this case, it's quite clear that the Islamic Jihad, a designated terrorist group, has really threatened Israeli families, and was the one to instigate it. While we have some people online that would argue that Israel defending itself and Jews refusing to be murdered is an act of aggression, I think that the storyline and the narrative that was presented in the international media was quite clear that Israel was taking actions to protect itself. However, I think that if you're looking at some of the arguments online, it sounds like people have really thought that Israel is on the side of the wrong in this conflict, but we were able to pass the message that Israel was defending Israeli families. And I think the story that the pro-Israel or the Jewish side was sharing online was a big part of why the situation was so less covered, and even if it was covered, more accurately than it was in May.
But again, though, you made the point of mentioning how people see clearly that Islamic Jihad is a terror group, but do they not see that about Hamas?
Hamas is not just a terror group. Hamas also takes care of the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. And while they are a terror group and they are a designated terror group that launch thousands of rockets on Israel throughout the years and has a clear agenda, there's still an element there of them protecting or serving as the government that leads the Gaza Strip. So that part, I think, was the difference between May to now. And again, I think the big element here that really changed the situation for Israel in this operation was the fact that we were able to tell our story truthfully, but also in an accurate way. So when at the Tel Aviv Institute, when we work with our influencers, we make sure that they talk about Israeli families and that they and that the media understands and that the world understands that this is an attack against Israeli civilians, that we are protecting civilians while the Islamic Jihad is using civilians to protect their weapon.
All right. I want to move now to the United Nations. Most nations largely condemned the conflict in the last couple of days, but few outside of Israel, like United States Ambassador Marjorie Taylor Greene, actually called the Islamic Jihad by name and called on them to be designated a terror group in other countries. What do you think of the response at the UNSC as opposed to the rhetoric Israel usually gets in times of conflict?
I think that the UN, some parts of the UN were indeed speaking up about the situation accurately, but we've seen several other UN officials really using a blunt anti-Semitism in their statements online, and that was very. I wouldn't say surprising because we know the stand of the UN and we know where the United Nations is standing on everything regarding Israel, but it is very troubling to see that, and I think that the UN, while we don't have many expectations or high standards to the UN actions, I think that it was interesting to see that there was some condemnation and more balanced approach with some of their statements.
All right, now I want to move back online actually and you spoke about this a little bit, but what are some of the general attitudes and the trends that you've seen in terms of the rhetoric about this conflict online, on social media, et cetera? And I know the Tel Aviv Institute, where you works with Jewish social media influencers. What have they been sharing during the operation?
So we immediately identified the key points that people react to in the most positive way. So we found that comparing the situation, because just last month, America targeted a senior leader in Al Qaeda that was involved with the 9/11 attacks, and that was really clear comparison for our side to say we have also taken down someone that has threatened Israeli families. So that was a key element in explaining the situation and explaining our side. The other part was to talk about Israeli civilians and making sure that we're talking about, rather than Israeli civilians, about Israeli families. And I think that we were able, by the analysis that we're doing at the Tel Aviv Institute, we saw that there was a shift in public opinion and people understood that Israel has the right to defend itself like any other country. And this is only a case of defense rather than attack, and that Israel wanted to finish this violence and kept on trying to stop it, and that there was a disproportionate response by the Islamic Jihad with thousands of rockets launched on Israeli families, and also that many of those rockets, I think that the majority of civilians that were killed in Gaza were killed by the Islamic Jihad misfired rockets. And that was an important point to articulate to the world, to make sure that people understand, if you care so much about Palestinian civilians, you would care about them being killed by the Islamic Jihad, unless you don't really care about Palestinians and you just care about who's killing them. And I mean, the problem is that civilians die in this conflict, and that's what we need to condemn. And I think those elements of the conversation were emphasized by our influencers, and we were able to really shift the conversation on social media. Some people that are always
Right.
will take the anti-Israel side will continue doing it, but I think that we saw a difference in this operation. That's something that I encourage every Jewish and pro-Israel and everyone that cares about our side to continue doing online.
Right. Ken Mazik, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Moving now to Vienna, are JCPOA-Iran nuclear negotiations finally over? The EU now submitting its so-called final text for review. ILTV's Kayla Everlin with the details.
Stalled for months before resuming last week, renewed JCPOA negotiations to curb Iran's nuclear program may finally be coming to a close. This, as the European Union submits its final text on Monday, with one anonymous EU official saying it will not be renegotiated. And this, just a few days after suggesting exhaustion over their everlasting talks.
C'est le temps pour le dernier effort pour discuter la récente proposition des représentants et prendre les décisions clés et décisives politiques dans les capitales des pays qui sont participants de JCPOA. Donc, le processus.
Meantime, Iran and the other P5+1 powers taking the EU's proposal home for review. Iran saying they'll respond as soon as they've gone over all the points. No news yet, however, on what exactly is in the agreement, and so what extent it addresses various sides' concerns.
Israelis have long been associated with that Mediterranean lifestyle. Beautifully bronzed and beach-ready models who live off of vegetables, olive oil, and coffee. But a new national health survey is actually showing that some 2/3 of Israelis fail to exercise as recommended, and that over half identify as either overweight or obese. So what happened, and how do we get back on track? With more is registered dietitian and certified fitness trainer Karen Ann Guyman. Karen, thank you so much for joining. Now, where did Israel stray? What are the biggest drivers for this unhealthy report card?
I think that the fundamental, let's call it, mistake that we do is that we don't give enough credit to our normal diet here in Israel, which is actually the Mediterranean diet. If we go abroad to Scandinavian countries like Denmark, for example, even if we go to England, the Mediterranean diet is considered a very exotic and healthy diet that many people choose to practice. Here in Israel, it's kind of given. It's kind of like our normal diet. And so many people try to look for more trendy diets, more exotic diets, and sometimes choose foods that are not actually the most healthy ones for us. Also, I find that Startup Nation, there's many startup companies here in Israel, is very much recognized with a lot of food, which is not necessarily healthy, but more luxurious. And so that could also be a problem. And also, sometimes it's really the basic knowledge of healthy nutrition, even though we kind of should know how to eat correctly here in Israel, many people still struggle with the definition of a healthy, balanced diet.
All right, well, the report actually also talks about not eating enough fresh fruit and vegetables. But is that because of a shift in appetite, as you kind of suggested, and and tastes shifting across demographics, or is it maybe more socioeconomically related even?
It really does depend. Let's start to break it down to two of these pillars. For example, here in my clinic, I see many patients that just are working very hard and they don't have a lot of time to cook and spend time in the kitchen. And chopping up a salad every day is something that is really challenging for them. So they rather have a quick dinner or a quick lunch and don't necessarily keep it in mind that vegetables are part of a balanced diet. Also, sometimes I see that it's just not in the culture of the family. I mean, eating vegetables and fresh fruit is not something that they're aware of. So for this type of situation, we have many ways to deal with it. So one could be like really working on it and maybe cutting a salad at the beginning of the day and having it throughout the day. And we have more options. For example, having miniature vegetables that you don't need to cut, and I deal with it in certain ways. Socioeconomical, that's really a big issue here in Israel. There are also ways that we could get over that. For example, if we go shopping at the end of the day, then we might have a discount on fruit and vegetables because we want to get them fresh the next day. Also going to the local market instead of supermarkets, we could find them cheaper there. So it really does differ between different families, and some it's on this background and some on that background.
All right, now the survey also suggests that people don't keep up with routine checkups. What checkups exactly does this refer to, and how regularly should we be getting them?
Okay, so the report specifically named, for example, the colon cancer. It's a colonoscopy that people should be doing over the age of 50, and the majority of people just don't. Also, we have checkups that are just routine every 6 months. Over the age of 20, we should be taking a general blood test to see our glucose level, to see if we're on the way to diabetes or not, to see LDL and HDL, which is the cholesterol. So there's many, many checkups that we should be doing. For women, soon we're going to go and get into October, which is breast cancer awareness. And so there's many, many different checkups that we should do. And it really is according to the age in which we're in. And all of those checkups are really super important because they help catch on time and prevent disease that could be life-ending. And that's a real big paradox in my opinion, because here in Israel, the healthcare is subsidized. So you don't even have to pay money to do those checkups. I just think it's really maybe in the Israeli culture that we're just too busy and really neglect our routine checkups. So I think that every Israeli should visit his general doctor at least 3 times a year and see the different checkups that he has to do or she has to do according to age and status.
So how can we turn things around towards that future you just described on a nationwide scale? How do we convince people to do this?
First of all, I think that interviews such like this are really eye-opening because sometimes people just don't know. They just don't know that from the age of 50 you should get screened for colon cancer. They just don't know that an adult person should do blood work twice a year. So talking about it and really raising awareness is the number one.
Karen, it was such a pleasure. Thank you so much again for joining.
Thank you very much.
Now, speaking of worrying trends, Israelis and Jews abroad increasingly concerned with preserving their heritage, a task that's becoming more and more difficult across generations especially. But Chinuch Yehudi, or the Jewish Education Organization, is trying to help. And joining to discuss is founder of the Jewish Academy School in Miami and director of the Chinuch Yehudi organization in Florida, Rabbi Yehuda Kornfeld. Rabbi, it's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining. Now, in preserving culture and tradition, education obviously is a major aspect. What are the main reasons that Israelis send or tend to send their children to public schools and not Jewish schools abroad?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you for having me. So first of all, just to put it into context, we're talking about surveys say more than 500,000 Israelis in America. That's more than 10% of the Jewish population in America. More than 90% of them do not send their children into Jewish education. Many reasons for that. We'll start with the first main reason is that, in Israel, schools are free. So in America, private schools are very expensive. And Israelis are just not used to paying for private schools. So that's something that it's not in the culture, in the Israeli culture. That's one reason. The second reason I would say is that they don't understand the whole idea of private Jewish schools in America, because public schools are rated by their academics excellence, like A, B, C. Private schools have no rating. So in some way, the Israelis thinks that private schools are not so good like the public schools, and by being immigrants, they think that by sending to public school, they made it into the society, which is so not true, because surveys say that private schools, kids score better, go to better colleges. So I think they just missed the concept of private schools. It's just not in the culture in Israel.
Well, so what are some of the differences between the public and the private Jewish schools in terms of values or education and Jewish heritage?
Right. So in public schools, as we all know, you cannot teach anything that has to do with religion.
Well, you
Nothing
can't
to do
preach
with
it, but
Jewish
you can
religion.
teach it in and of itself, but you're not supposed to preach any one religion.
Right. Right. So you cannot teach anything that has to do with religion. Maybe put it as a culture, but it's against the law. So you can't get any Jewish religion or any religion in the public schools. And by Jewish school, it's a private school, so you could do whatever you want, and you could teach the Jewish education, values. You get the connection to Israel, Zionist, and all those things that Israelis really should want, especially by being immigrants in America and understanding that over 70% intermarriage are in the second and third generation. By the way, surveys show that there's more intermarriage in the Israeli community than the Jewish community, which is shocking to a lot of people. And probably the reason is because the Israeli community is also not connected to any community. Jewish community are connected. Even if you don't send to Jewish schools, you're connected to JCC, all kinds of, communities. But Israelis are not connected to the communities. Therefore, their second generation, the kids who grow in America, do not get any connection of Jewish identity. Therefore, it's even more important for them to send to Jewish education.
All right, now we know that there are many different kinds of schools, different rated schools, as you mentioned before. How do you know which school fits each student? How do you find the right match? And how do you manage actually to also help those students get into those schools and overcome some of those issues that you mentioned earlier, like transportation, price, etc.?
Right. So first of all, you have to do your research about even private schools, even though they're good. And in my opinion, they're better than, public schools. But you have to do your research. There's different types of private schools, and you have to see that it's good for your child. In terms of tuition, Chinuch Yehudi organization, the mission is to get different scholarships from different organizations and help those children. Our mission is that no Jewish child should have to go to public school just because of financial issues. It should not happen. Every Jewish child should have the opportunity to have Jewish education. And therefore, first of all, we get scholarships from different organizations, including our organization, Chinuch Yehudi, to give the child the opportunity to come to Jewish schools. We actually negotiate with the Jewish schools, with the private schools, by coming to them and say to them, we're giving money to this school. We're getting scholarships. You also have to help.
All right. Rabbi Kornfeld, thank you so much for joining us again today.
Thank you for having me.
Let's take a look at the weather forecast. The forecast is calling for a mix of clear and partly cloudy skies across the country, both this evening and tomorrow, with tonight's lows averaging 22 degrees Celsius or 71 Fahrenheit. And then tomorrow, temperatures remaining constant with top highs reaching 34 Celsius or 93 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's all for today's news. For more updates from Israel and around the world, check out our website, ILTV.tv. You can also subscribe to our newsletter and join us on our streaming platform at ILTV+, and you can catch that across all of your devices. I'm Aaron Porras. Be well. Thank you so much for watching. Will your children grow up Jewish? It all depends on their education. For more information about an Israeli scholarship, scan the QR code here.